They were the enemy, captured and brought to the heart of their adversary's land. They expected hardship, hostility, and hunger, but what they found behind the barbed wire was something that shattered every expectation and challenged everything they'd been told. A sight so bewildering, so abundant, it became a weapon more powerful than any they had faced on the battlefield. This is not a story about war. This is a story about a plate of food, a shared cigarette, and the moment two enemies saw each other not as soldiers, but as men. Get ready for a journey into a forgotten chapter history that will redefine what you think you know about compassion and the human spirit. The land of unimaginable plenty. The cattle car screeched to a final, groaning halt. Inside, a mass of weary, gray-uniformed men braced themselves, their world reduced to the stench of sweat, fear, and stale hay. Karl Muller, a 22-year-old former schoolteacher from Hamburg, closed his eyes. He prepared for shouting, the rough hands of guards, the barren landscape of captivity he had been conditioned to expect. The propaganda films flashed in his memory. Grim Soviet gulags, British work camps on meager rations. The doors slid open with a deafening clang. Instead of hostility, a strange, almost mundane silence greeted him. Squinting against the harsh afternoon sun, Carl's first sight of America was the towering figure of a U.S. Army sergeant. Sergeant James Jim Coulter, a man in his late 30s with a weathered face and calm eyes that held no visible malice. All right, let's go. Form ranks. Schnell. Jim's voice was firm but not cruel, his German rudimentary but effective. The prisoners, disoriented and weak, stumbled into formation. Carl's eyes scanned the perimeter. The barbed wire was there. Yes, the watchtowers, armed with machine guns, were a cold reality. But beyond them stretched endless fields of ripe corn, swaying like a golden sea. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. It was a landscape of impossible abundance, not the war-torn scarcity of Europe. They were marched toward a mess hall, a long, low-slung building. A smell wafted from its vents. A rich, fatty, utterly alien aroma that made Carl's empty stomach clench with a painful mix of hunger and suspicion. What was this? A trick? He exchanged a nervous glance with his friend, Gerhard, a hardened veteran from the Eastern Front. Gerhard's face, usually a mask of cynical defiance, was etched with pure confusion. They entered the hall. The sight that greeted them was more shocking than any battlefield. Before them were mountains of food. Steam rose from vast cauldrons of stew. There was real white bread, not the coarse Kriegsbrot they were used to. There was butter. There was even what looked like oranges. Carl accepted a tray, his hands trembling. A young American private behind the counter, barely older than Carl himself, slopped a generous portion of stew onto his plate and gave a curt, almost apologetic nod. Carl found a spot at a crowded table, his mind reeling. He stared at the food as if it were a complex puzzle. This was the meal of the victor. This was the meal of their captors. Why were they being given it? He took a tentative bite of the stew, beef, real potatoes, carrots. The flavors exploded in his mouth, a shocking symphony of richness and health. He saw men around him, these proud soldiers of the Wehrmacht, eating with the frantic, desperate urgency of starved animals. Some had tears streaming down their faces, onto their trays. The abundance wasn't just nourishment. It was a psychological earthquake. Everything they had been told about the decadent, weak Americans and their failing war effort crumbled away with every mouthful. The first enemy they had to face in this new land was not a soldier, but the devastating, undeniable truth on their plates. The kindness of the guard. The days at Camp Concordia bled into one another, structured by a routine that felt more surreal with each passing sunrise. For Karl Muller, the shock of that first meal had not faded. It had deepened into a constant, low hum of cognitive dissonance. The barbed wire was real. The armed patrols were real. But so was the coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter acorn brew they'd had for years. That came with breakfast. So was a slice of apple pie that sometimes appeared at dinner. His mind, trained for logic and analysis, fought to reconcile it all. He'd been taught the enemy was a monstrous, soulless entity. Yet, the guards, while maintaining a professional distance, were not brutal. They were bored. They were homesick boys from farms in Iowa and offices in New York. Carl, one of the few who spoke passable English, became an unwilling interpreter, and in doing so, he became a silent observer of his captors. The man who fascinated him most was Sergeant Coulter. The sergeant ran his camp with a quiet, efficient competence. He didn't bark needless orders. He didn't revel in his power. One afternoon, during a work detail assigning prisoners to repair a section of the camp's internal road, Carl saw something that would stay with him. A young guard, Private Danny Miller, the same one who served Stu that first day, was clumsily trying to shout orders at a group of older POWs who pretended not to understand. His frustration was palpable, his voice cracking with adolescent anxiety. Sergeant Coulter watched from a distance for a few minutes, his arms crossed. Then he walked over, not with anger, but with the weary patience of father. He placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. "Ease up, son. They're not deaf. They're just scared." He then turned to the prisoners and, using simple words and hand gestures, calmly explained the task. The men, disarmed by the lack of hostility, nodded and set to work. Later that day, Carl was on a detail near the fence, hauling gravel. He saw Sergeant Coulter sitting on an upturned crate, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the Nebraskan plains that stretched to the horizon. It was Private Miller who approached him, his helmet off, looking ashamed. "I messed up out there, Sarge," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. I want them to know they can't push us around." Coulter took a long drag of a cigarette. "Miller, what's your job here?" "To guard the prisoners, sir." "Right. And are they attempting to escape?" Coulter asked, gestured with his chin at the men working diligently. "No, sir." "Are they being violent? Insolent?" "No, sir." "Then you're doing your job just fine. Your job isn't to terrorize them. It's to contain them. There's a difference." He offered the young private a cigarette. "These men, a lot of them, are just like you. They got drafted. They fought for their country, and they lost. They're not SS fanatics. Most are just farmers and mechanics. Remember that. Makes it easier to look at M without wanting to spit." Carl quickly looked down, shoveling gravel with a sudden intensity, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had understood every word. The sergeant's words were not a gesture of friendship, but they were a form of respect, a recognition of shared, if opposed, humanity. It was a concept utterly alien to the world Carl had just left. The tension, however, was not confined to the interactions between captor and captive. It simmered within the prisoner population itself. Gerhard, his friend from the train, became increasingly sullen and withdrawn. The American abundance was, to him, a deeper insult than any deprivation. One evening in their sparse barracks, as men wrote letters home on precious Red Cross paper, Gerhard sat on his bunk, sharpening a spoon handle into a shiv with furious, meticulous strokes. "This is how they break us, Carl," he hissed, not looking up. "Not with clubs, but with their charity. They stuff us like Christmas geese to show us how weak we are, to make us forget who we are. Or perhaps they are just not the monsters we were told they were." Carl said quietly, looking up from a letter to his mother he didn't know would ever be sent. Gerhard's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "Do not be a fool. This is a psychological war. They fatten us up so we feel indebted, so we become compliant. They want to strip away our pride, our very identity as German soldiers. They are not kind. They are cunning." Their debate was cut short by a commotion outside. Shouting, English and German voices mixed in alarm. Carl and Gerhard rushed to the window. Outside, in the compound, a prisoner from another barracks, a man named Becker, known for his fiery Nazi rhetoric, was on the ground, clutching his chest, his face contorted in agony. Two guards were running towards him, but they hesitated, unsure. A circle of prisoners had formed around him, their faces masks of fear and helplessness. Sergeant Coulter pushed through the crowd, his authority cutting through the panic. He knelt beside the writhing man, barking orders. "Miller, get the medic. Now. You, Muller," he shouted, his eyes finding Carl's in the window. "Get out here and translate." Carl didn't think. He ran outside, pushing through the crowd to kneel opposite Coulter. The sergeant's face was all business, but his eyes showed genuine concern. "Ask him what's wrong." Where's the pain? Coulter demanded. Carl translated rapidly. Becker, gasping, managed to spit out the words. My chest of ice, can't breathe. Heart, Coulter said grimly to Carl. Tell him to try and stay calm. Help is coming. In that moment, under the harsh glare of the compound lights, the hierarchies of war dissolved. They were no longer sergeant, prisoner, and translator. There were three men clustered around a fourth who was dying. Carl relayed Coulter's calming words, his own voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He saw the fear in Becker's eyes, a universal human fear, and saw Coulter respond to it not as an enemy, but as a man responsible for another man's life. The camp medic arrived with a stretcher, and Becker was rushed away. The crowd slowly dispersed, a somber mood replacing the panic. As Carl turned to go back to his barracks, Sergeant Coulter stopped him with a quiet word. Muller. Yes, Sergeant. Coulter looked at him for a long moment, then simply said, You did good. The words were insignificant, yet they landed on Carl with the weight of a benediction. He walked back to his bunk, Gerhard's cynical words echoing in one ear, Sergeant Coulter's quiet praise in the other. The battle for his soul, he realized, was not being fought with rifles or propaganda, but in these small, quiet moments of unexpected humanity, hidden behind the wire in the heart of America, the farmer's fence. The incident with Becker left a pall over the camp. He had survived, thanks to the swift work of the American medic and a rush trip to the local civilian hospital, a fact that was relayed to prisoners with a simple, posted notice. The message was clear. Your lives have value here. For some, like Carl, it was a further affirmation of a bewildering new reality. For others, like Gerhard, it was a more sophisticated form of manipulation. They saved one to control 5,000, he muttered that night. Do not be so quick to trust their charity. A new work detail was announced. A local farmer, a Mr. Henry O'Malley, whose land bordered the camp, had petitioned the Army for labor. A section of his old stone boundary wall had collapsed, and he needed strong hands to clear the debris and rebuild. Sergeant Cowell handpicked the detail, selecting 20 men, including Carl for his English and Gerhard for his brute strength. It was a privilege, a chance to breathe air untainted by the faint scent of disinfectant and despair that hung over the compound. The morning they marched out the main gate, flanked by 2 jeeps and guards, including Private Miller, felt momentous. The autumn sun was warm on their faces. The air was crisp and smelled of dry earth and decaying leaves. For the first time in years, Carl felt a sensation he thought the war had killed, the simple pleasure of a beautiful day. The O'Malley farm was a picture of American pastoral prosperity. A large white clapboard house with a wide porch stood proudly on a small rise. A red barn, seemingly larger than the entire apartment block Carl had grown up in, stood behind it. A windmill turned lazily in the breeze. Chickens pecked in the yard, and a dog barked a half-hearted warning from the porch. It was a scene of peace and stability that felt like a dream. Mr. O'Malley was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a weathered face and suspicious eyes that scanned the prisoners like they were a blight on his land. He pointed a thick finger at the pile of tumbled rocks along his fence line. There's the mess. Get it sorted. He didn't say another word, simply turning his back and walking towards his barn, his disdain of physical force. The work was hard, manual labor, but to the prisoners, it was a taste of freedom. They worked with a will, the rhythm of lifting, and carrying feeling good after the idleness of the camp. Carl found himself near Private Miller, who was leaning against a jeep, rifle slung, watching the horizon more than the men. After an hour, a screen door on the house slammed shut. A young woman, perhaps 18, emerged carrying a large jug and a stack of tin cups. She had her father's sturdy build, but a kindness in her eyes he lacked. She was followed by an older woman, her mother, holding a basket covered with a cloth. Pa said to bring these out. The girl said to Miller, her voice soft, It's just lemonade. Miller nodded, looking nervous. Thank you, Miss O'Malley. As the girl began pouring the lemonade, her eyes met Carl's. He was closest, sweating and covered in a fine gray dust from the limestone. She hesitated for only a second before holding out a cup to him. It was an instinctual act of Midwestern hospitality, so ingrained it momentarily overrode the propaganda of war. Carl froze. He looked at the cup, beating with condensation. He looked at Miller, whose hand tightened on his rifle. He looked at Gerhard, who stopped working to glare, his face a thundercloud. "Go on," the girl said, her voice firmer now. "You look parched." Slowly, Carl reached out and took the cup. His dusty fingers brushed against hers. "Thank you," he said, the English words feeling thick on his tongue. The lemonade was the most astonishing thing he had ever tasted. Tart and sweet and colder than anything he'd experienced in years. It was a taste of innocence, of a world untouched by rationing and ruin. He drank it down in a few grateful gulps. It was then that Mr. O'Malley returned from a barn. He took in the scene in an instant, his daughter handing a drink to a German prisoner, the prisoner drinking it with a look of profound gratitude, the other prisoners watching with hopeful eyes. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "Abigail, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" he roared, storming across the yard. The girl flinched. I know what you were just doing. Get back in the house. Now!" He snatched the jug from her hands. He turned his fury on Miller. "And you let this happen? You let my daughter fraternize with the enemy? These are the men who killed the Larson boy. They killed boys from this very county." Miller stood up straight, his youthful face pale. "Sir, Don't serve me. They're here to work, not to be served refreshments by my family." O'Malley's eyes then landed on Carl, who was still holding the empty tin cup. The farmer's rage found its target. He strode over and slapped the cup from Carl's hand, sending it clattering into the stones. "You," he snarled, his face inches from Carl's. "You think you can come here? To my country? To my land? And take what isn't yours? You think a uniform is all that separates you from the animals that burn their way across Europe?" The air crackled with tension. The other prisoners had stopped working, their hands clenched into fists. The guards on the jeeps unslung their rifles. Gerhard took a step forward, his eyes promising violence. Carl stood perfectly still, his heart pounding. He was looking into the face of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was the enemy he had been prepared to meet. This was the face he expected to see in America. And in a terrible, twisted way, it made more sense to him than the kindness of the mess hall or the lemonade. This he understood. But before anyone could move, another voice cut through the tension, calm and authoritative. "That's enough, Mr. O'Malley." Sergeant Coulter had arrived, his jeep pulling up silently on the gravel road. He stepped out, not rushing, his demeanor cool and controlled. He positioned himself between the farmer and Carl. "This man is under the authority of the United States Army," Coulter said, his voice low, but leaving no room for argument. "You requested labor. You got it. My men are here to ensure that labor is performed and that everyone, civilian and prisoner alike, remains safe. You will not interfere again." O'Malley was still seething, but Coulter's official tone and steady gaze drained some of the fight from him. He spat on the ground near Carl's feet. "Get them off my land by sundown, Sergeant, and don't expect me to ask for your help again." He turned and stalked back to his house, leaving a silence heavier than the stones they were moving. Coulter watched him go, then turned to the detail. Back to work. His eyes met Carl's for a brief second, and in them, Carl saw something unexpected. Not sympathy, but shared understanding of the complex, painful world they were now trapped in together. The ride back to camp that evening was utterly silent. The taste of lemonade had been replaced by the metallic fear of true, raw hatred. The walls of the camp, when they saw them again, felt less like a prison and more like a fragile shield against a world that was far more complicated than either side had ever imagined. The cigarette and the photograph, the silence from the farm festered. It clung to the work detail on the jeep ride back to Camp Concordia and seeped into the barracks that night. Gerhard's narrative had been vindicated. "You see," he'd whispered in the dark, his voice a low, triumphant venom. "The father shows his true face. The kindness of the daughter was a lie of youth. The American heart is a fickle thing. It is only the sergeant's rules that keep the animal on its leash." Carl said nothing. He lay on his bunk, staring at the springs of the bed above him, trying to reconcile the girl's instinctive kindness with her father's blistering hate. Which was the real America? The next day, a heavy rain fell, turning the compound into a sea of mud and canceling all outdoor work details. A restless energy filled the camp. Men mended clothes, played endless games of chess with carved pieces, or simply stared out the windows at the gray, weeping sky. The confinement, which had felt spacious compared to a cattle car, now felt suffocating. During a lull in the afternoon downpour, Carl was tasked with helping Private Miller move some supply crates from a delivery truck into a storage shed near the administration building. The work was monotonous, a rhythm of lift, carry, stack. The only sound was the drumming of rain on the corrugated metal roof and their grunts of effort. After the last crate was stacked, Miller leaned against the doorframe, catching his breath. He looked young and tired, the bravado from his first days as a guard completely worn away. He pulled a pack of Lucky Strikes from his breast pocket, tapped one out, and lit it, taking a deep drag. He offered the pack, a silent, automatic gesture of camaraderie between two men who have shared a task. Carl hesitated. The memory of Mr. O'Malley's fury was still fresh. This was fraternization. This was exactly what the farmer had raged against. Miller seemed to realize it a second later. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. But instead of pulling the pack back, he held it steady. An invitation. A test. Slowly, Carl reached out and took a cigarette. Miller struck another match and held the flame for him. The simple act, the cupping of hands against the wind, the shared light, felt more intimate than any conversation they could have had. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the rain, smoking the enemy's tobacco. "He was wrong, you know," Miller said finally, his voice quiet. He didn't need to say who. O'Malley. What he said. What he did. Carl just nodded, inhaling the rich, unfamiliar smoke. "My brother, he's with the 1st Infantry. Somewhere in France." Miller's words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for weeks. "I haven't gotten a letter in a month. Every day I report for duty, I look at you guys, and I wonder if someone over there is giving him a cigarette. Or if someone's, you know." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Carl understood the unspeakable fear that lived in the heart of every soldier, every family member. It was a universal currency of dread. "I hope they are," Carl said, the English words feeling clumsy but earnest. "I hope someone shows him kindness." Miller looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded, his throat working. The moment was broken by the sound of the camp's PA system crackling to life, calling for the change of guard. Miller dropped his cigarette, grinding it into the dirt floor with his boot. "We should get back." As Carl turned to go, a small, waterproof photograph fell from Miller's pocket. Carl bent and picked it up before Miller noticed. It was a picture of a young woman with a bright, smiling face, holding a baby. On the back, in a delicate cursive, was written, "To Danny, all our love, Sarah and little James." "Private," Carl said, holding it out. Miller turned, and his face softened when he saw the photo. He took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. "My wife," he said, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "And my boy. He was born 2 weeks after I shipped out. I've never held him." The confession hung in the damp air of the shed, a raw, painful truth. This American boy, his guard, his captor, was just as much a prisoner of this war as he was. A prisoner of distance, of fear, of missing a life that was moving on without him. That evening, the rain finally ceased. A profound quiet settled over the camp, broken only by the distant sound of harmonica, playing a lonely, homesick tune. Carl found Gerhard standing at the barracks window, staring out at the watchtowers, their searchlights cutting through the clean, rain-washed air. "The weather is clearing," Gerhard said without turning around. "The work details will resume tomorrow. Back to the farmer's field. No doubt." "Perhaps," Carl said. Gerhard finally turned. His eyes were hard. "The sergeant protects us only because it is his duty. The boy guard is soft because he is weak and scared. Do not mistake their constraints for compassion, Carl. The moment it is convenient, the mask will slip, O'Malley's face is a true face. Remember that. But Carl couldn't forget the other faces. The tired, homesick face of Private Miller, missing a son he'd never met. The calm, professional face of Sergeant Coulter, enforcing humanity he didn't have to. Even the kind, nervous face of Abigail O'Malley, offering lemonade against a backdrop of hate. He lay in his bunk that night, not thinking of borders or ideologies, but of a photograph, a smiling woman, a baby named James, a father who had never held his son. The war had drawn a line between them, designating them enemies. But Carl felt, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that the line was a lie. The real divide wasn't between nations, but between those who chose to see the individual humanity on the other side, and those, like Gerhard and Mr. O'Malley, who willfully refused to see it at all. The battle was no longer outside. It was here, in this barracks, in his own heart. And he knew, with a terrifying clarity, which side he was now on. The choice. The news crackled to the camp not via the PA system, but through the low, urgent whispers of men who had been listening to the guards' radios. It was early May 1945. The rain had given way to a tentative spring, but a new, electric tension had taken its place. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For the men behind a wire of Camp Concordia, the news was not a cause for celebration, but a seismic shock that left them utterly unmoored. Their world, defined by the strict, brutal logic of war, had simply vanished. What were they now? They were no longer soldiers. They were not yet civilians. They were ghosts in a limbo between a lost past and an unimaginable future. A profound anxiety settled over the barracks. What would the Americans do with them now? Vengeance was a whispered fear. Would they be handed over to the Soviets? A fate considered worse than death? Would they be tried as war criminals? The boundless American food now tasted like ash in their mouths, each meal feeling like a possible last. Carl watched Gerhard closely. His friend's defiant nationalism had curdled into a desperate, volatile nihilism. He spoke in low, furious tones to a small group of like-minded men, his eyes burning with fanatical fire. This is it. Carl heard him hiss one evening. They will not ship us back as heroes. They will make examples of us. We must show them we are not defeated in spirit. We must remind them who we are. Carl's blood ran cold. He didn't know what reminding meant, but he knew it would be violent, stupid, and tragic. It was the old world trying to drag the new one down into the abyss with it. 2 days later, the order came. Sergeant Coulter assembled the entire camp in the main compound. Thousands of men stood in silent rows under the vast Nebraska sky. Coulter stood on a wooden platform, his face grim and unreadable. He didn't need a translator. His message was simple, and he delivered it slowly, clearly. "The war is over," he began, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "You will be processed and repatriated to Germany. It will take time. You will remain here until that process begins. There will be no trouble. Any act of violence, any disobedience, will be met with the full force of military law. This is over. Act like it." A collective sigh, a mixture of relief and dread, moved through the crowd. But as the men were dismissed, Carl saw Gerhard's face. It was a mask of pure fury. Coulter's speech, meant to ensure order, had been the final provocation. That night, Carl lay awake, listening to the ragged breathing of hundreds of lost men. He heard the faint creak of Gerhard's bunk, the soft shuffle of feet. He saw a shadow move towards the barracks door. This was it. The stupid, glorious, catastrophic gesture. Without thinking, Carl slid from his bunk and followed. He found Gerhard near the latrines, huddled with 2 others. They were fashioning crude weapons from broken tools, a sharpened shovel handle, a rock and a sock. "Gerhard," Carl whispered, stepping out of the shadows. His friend spun around, eyes wide with alarm, then narrowed with contempt. "Muller, go back to bed. This does not concern you. It concerns all of us. What are you doing? We are going to paint a swastika on the water tower. We are going to show them that the fight is not over, that the idea lives on." "The idea is dead," Carl pleaded, his voice desperate. "All you will do is get yourself shot, or get others shot. For what? A symbol on a tank of water? Is that the legacy you want? It is about honor. Gerhard spat, stepping closer. Something you have clearly forgotten, cozying up to the sergeant and his pet guard. You eat their food, and you think you are one of them. You are a traitor. The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Carl felt a door slam shut between his past and his future. He looked at his friend, this hollowed-out vessel of hate, and he felt an immense pity. "No," Carl said, his voice quiet but firm, no longer a whisper. "I am not a traitor to Germany. I am a traitor to the madness that destroyed it, and I will not let you bring that madness here." Before Gerhard could react, Carl turned and ran. He ran not towards the safety of his barracks, but towards a guard tower, towards a one man he believed might understand. He ran, his heart hammering against his ribs, a definitive act of betrayal that felt, to his own surprise, like the first true act of loyalty to his own conscience he had ever committed. He was challenged twice by guards, his frantic German making them raise their rifles before they recognized him and call for Sergeant Coulter. Coulter emerged from the administration building, pulling on his jacket, his face alert. "Muller? What is it?" "Sergeant, it's Gerhard and others. They have weapons, the water tower." Carl gasped, the words tumbling out in a broken mix of English and German. Coulter's eyes hardened. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He barked orders into a radio. Sirens blared, piercing the night. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping across the compound, converging on the latrine area. The plot was foiled in minutes. Gerhard and his comrades were found, not as glorious revolutionaries, but as scared, shivering men caught in the act of pointless sabotage. They were disarmed and led away to the brig, Gerhard shooting a look of pure, undiluted hatred at Carl, who stood beside Sergeant Coulter. The camp fell back into an uneasy silence. Coulter turned to Carl. The searchlights illuminated the weary lines on the sergeant's face. "You did the right thing, son," Coulter said. It was the first time he'd used that word. "A lot of men will go home to their families because of what you did tonight, including him, though he'll never thank you for it." Carl simply nodded, exhausted, his body trembling from the adrenaline crash. He looked up at the American sky, dotted with countless stars unseen in the blackout skies of Europe. He was still a prisoner. He was still behind the wire. But as he walked back to his barracks under the watchful, protective gaze of the guards, he understood that true freedom had never been about the wire at all. It had been about the choice he made in the dark, to protect life over an idea, to choose a difficult future over a catastrophic past. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, and for the first time since he put on a uniform, he felt completely, utterly free. This story shows us that humanity can be found in the most unexpected places, even between enemies. If this journey moved you, help us share more untold stories of courage and connection. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us of our shared human spirit. What would you have done in Carl's situation? Let us know in the comments below.